Pull the blanket a little closer tonight. Let the room settle around you. Whatever the day held, whatever you carried through it, whatever small weight you are still holding even now, you can set it down right here, right at the edge of sleep. Tonight we are going somewhere that looks very familiar at first glance. A lamplit drawing room, a fire burning low in the hearth, a woman in silk sitting with perfect posture, her hands folded in her lap, her face composed into an expression of gentle serenity. Across from her, a man in a dark coat reads a newspaper. The clock on the mantel ticks. A maid moves quietly in the hall. Everything is orderly. Everything is proper. Everything is exactly as it should be. And yet, if you could lean in close, if you could watch the woman's eyes move to the window, watch the slight tension in her jaw, watch the way her hands press just a little too tightly together, you would begin to understand that not everything in that room is as still as it appears. Because here is something that Victorian England wanted the world to believe about itself. It believed, or at least claimed to believe, that it had solved something the ancient world had never quite managed. It believed that it had civilized desire, contained it, dressed it properly, married it off, given it a respectable address and a respectable surname, and locked the door behind it. But desire is not the kind of thing that stays where you put it. And tonight, we are going to open some of those locked doors, gently, quietly, the way you might open a very old letter that was never meant to be read by anyone else. We are going to step inside the private lives of Victorian England, into its drawing rooms and its back staircases, its correspondence and its courtrooms, its scandals and its silences. We are going to look at what happened behind the polished surface of the most morally certain society the modern world had ever produced. And what we will find there is not simply gossip. It is not simply scandal for the pleasure of scandal. What we will find is something far more interesting and far more human than that. We will find that the stricter the rules, the more elaborate the language of breaking them became. We will find that the same society that produced the sternest moral sermons also produced some of the most passionate secret correspondence ever written. We will find that the people history remembers as perfectly composed were, underneath that composure, burning with the same longing, the same confusion, the same private desperation that human beings in every era have always carried. We will find that Victorian England's greatest secret was not that some of its people committed adultery. Its greatest secret was how many did, and how completely the whole structure of society was built to hide it. Before we go any further, I want to give you a sense of the scale of what we are talking about, because Victorian adultery is sometimes discussed as though it were an occasional aberration, the failing of weak individuals unable to meet the moral standards of their age. The evidence, when you look at it carefully, suggests something quite different. By the 1870s and 1880s, London alone was home to an estimated 80,000 women involved in some form of sex work, a figure that shocked contemporary reformers who tried to calculate it and shocked historians who have revisited those calculations since. These numbers included women working in the most visible street-level trade, but they also included the kept women, the part-time arrangements, the women in circumstances that defied easy categorization but that all shared the common feature of existing entirely outside the official moral narrative of the age. The divorce court, which kept meticulous records from 1858 onward, processed thousands of cases in its first 2 decades, far more than the framers of the Matrimonial Causes Act had anticipated. The courts had been designed with an expected volume in mind. The volume exceeded it almost immediately. The Society for the Suppression of Vice, founded in 1802 and still active throughout the Victorian era, prosecuted hundreds of cases every year related to obscene publications, illicit meeting houses, and what the reformers called disorderly conduct, a category that encompassed an enormous range of human behavior that the official moral framework could not accommodate. None of this means that Victorian England was simply a place of rampant immorality hiding behind a respectable face. The picture is more complicated and more human than that. Many people lived lives that were in fact more or less what they appeared to be: faithful marriages, genuine religious conviction, sincere attachment to the values of duty and respectability. The surface was not entirely performance. Some of it was real. But the scale of the hidden life, the sheer number of people living in some form of emotional or sexual parallel to their official existence, tells us something that the sermons and the conduct manuals and the idealized domestic imagery refused to acknowledge. It tells us that the system was not working as advertised, that the model of human nature it rested on, the controllable, perfectible, domestic, angelic human being, bore no real resemblance to the actual human beings who were being asked to embody it. And the failure was not a failure of individual character, it was a failure of the model itself. This is the hidden truth that runs beneath all of Victorian England's hidden love affairs, all of its secret letters and coded flower arrangements and carefully maintained second lives. The scandal was not the adultery. The scandal was the system that made it inevitable and then punished the people who succumbed to it for being human in precisely the way the system had refused to account for. There is a phrase that circulated among Victorian social reformers, people who were trying, often against considerable resistance, to draw attention to the gap between the official moral narrative and the lived reality beneath it. They called it, in their pamphlets and their parliamentary petitions and their quietly explosive books, the great social evil. And they meant by this prostitution primarily. But the phrase had a wider resonance that its users perhaps did not entirely intend. The great social evil, the thing that existed everywhere and was discussed nowhere, the thing that the entire official framework of Victorian moral life required to be simultaneously present and invisible, acknowledged and denied, managed and ignored. What I find significant about this phrase, what makes it linger, is the precision of the word social, not personal evil, not individual evil. Social evil. An evil that belonged to the structure, not to the people caught inside the structure. An acknowledgement tucked into the very language the reformers used, that what was happening was not the failure of individual morality, but the product of a social arrangement. Some of the most interesting Victorian writing about this subject came from women who had every reason to keep their observations private and who chose instead to make them public. Josephine Butler, the social reformer whose campaign against the Contagious Diseases Acts in the 1860s and 1870s constitutes one of the most remarkable single-person advocacy efforts in Victorian history, understood with extraordinary precision how the system worked and who it worked for. The Contagious Diseases Acts, passed in 1864, 1866, and 1869, allowed police in certain garrison towns to arrest any woman suspected of being a prostitute and subject her to compulsory medical examination. Men who used the services of these women were not subject to any examination, any arrest, any inconvenience whatsoever. Butler campaigned against this with a moral fury that made her deeply uncomfortable to the establishment of her day, because she was not simply making a technical legal argument, she was making a philosophical one. She was arguing that the system was not designed to control immorality. It was designed to control women, to manage the risks of male desire by placing all of the burden of that management on the bodies and the freedoms of women. She won, eventually. The acts were suspended in 1883 and repealed in 1886, but the logic they embodied, the logic that female bodies bear the costs of male desire, that virtue is primarily a female responsibility, that the management of sexual risk is properly a female burden, did not disappear with the legislation. It simply found other forms. Tonight we begin at the very beginning, at the surface itself, at the extraordinary, ornate, elaborately constructed idea of respectability that Victorian England built as its public face. Because to understand what was hidden, you first have to understand just how much effort went into the hiding. So settle in. Let the night be soft around you. This is a long story, and it deserves to be told slowly. If you are new here, this is Dreamy Ages, a channel for long, slow, late-night journeys through the quieter corners of history. If these kinds of stories are what you come to for your evenings, consider subscribing and leaving a comment. It genuinely means a great deal. Now, let us begin. Picture England in the middle of the 19th century, not the England of muddy fields and plague years that we sometimes associate with the distant past. This England is modern, or at least it believes itself to be. It has railways cutting through green countryside. It has gas lamps flickering to life along city streets at dusk. It has department stores and illustrated newspapers and a postal system so reliable that a letter sent in the morning could reach its destination across the city by afternoon. It is an England in motion, an England of industry and empire, of ambition and invention, and at the center of all of it, quietly presiding, is a queen who has become something more than a monarch. Victoria is a symbol, a living, breathing embodiment of everything her era claims to believe in. Domestic virtue, moral seriousness, the sacred sanctity of marriage and home. She married for love, or so the story went, and her grief at the death of Prince Albert in 1861 was so profound, so visible, so publicly performed through decades of black mourning clothes and ritual withdrawal that it became a kind of national template. This is what love looks like, the image seemed to say. This is how seriously we take our bonds. This is what it means to be faithful. And the middle and upper classes of England took that template and built a whole architecture of life around it. The home became sacred, not simply a house, not simply a shelter, but a moral universe in miniature. The Victorian domestic home was supposed to be In the famous phrase of John Ruskin, a place of peace, a shelter from the storms of the outside world, a space of purity managed by a woman of virtue, presided over by a man of character, populated by children being raised in goodness and light. The wife was the angel of this space. This was not a metaphor used casually. The Angel in the House, the title of a famous and widely read poem by Coventry Patmore, published in the 1850s, described the ideal Victorian wife with the kind of language usually reserved for religious figures. She was patient, she was selfless, she was pure. She existed to serve, to soothe, to inspire the better nature of the man in her life. She had no ambitions that extended beyond his comfort and the well-being of her children. What fascinates me here, and I want to pause on this for just a moment, is not simply that this image was idealized. Every era creates idealized images of femininity. What is striking about the Victorian version is the totality of the demand it made. It did not simply ask women to be good. It asked them to be good in a way that left no room for selfhood, no desires of their own, no inconvenient feelings, no private life that did not flow directly from their role as wife and mother. And into this perfect, airless arrangement, men brought their own contradictions. Because Victorian men were also caught in a kind of impossible position. On one side, they were expected to be upright, moral, self-controlled, respectable, church-going, the kind of man who could look other respectable men in the eye. On the other side, the culture quietly, insistently acknowledged that men had appetites, that these appetites were natural, even inevitable, that they required an outlet. And so Victorian society did something quite remarkable. It built two worlds, one visible, one hidden, one spoken about, one never mentioned in polite company, one for the public presentation of respectability, and one for everything that respectability could not contain. The visible world was the drawing room, the church pew, the dinner party, the professional club, the family portrait. The hidden world was something else entirely, and we will spend much of tonight walking through it. But first, to understand why adultery was so dangerous, so devastating, so charged with consequence in this particular era, we need to understand exactly what marriage was in Victorian England, not what people said it was, not what the poems and the sermons claimed it to be, but what it actually was. Legally, socially, emotionally, what it meant for the people who lived inside it. Because once you understand the cage, you begin to understand why so many people, so quietly, so desperately, went looking for an open window. Marriage in Victorian England was not at its root a romantic institution. This is perhaps the most important thing to understand, and it is the thing that the sentimental imagery of the era most successfully conceals. Marriage was a legal contract. It was a financial arrangement. It was a social mechanism for the transfer of property, the legitimization of children, and the management of class status. Particularly among the middle and upper classes, marriages were negotiated, families met, finances were assessed, lineages were compared, a young woman's portion, the money or property she brought to the marriage, was discussed with the same seriousness as any other business transaction. A young man's prospects were examined. His income, his profession, his family connections, the likelihood of inheritance. These were the practical foundations upon which the rest was built. Love, if it existed, was a bonus, a pleasant coincidence, something to be hoped for, certainly, but not something to be relied upon. Many people did fall genuinely in love within marriages arranged along these lines. Many others fell into something that looked like love because the social script demanded it. And many others simply settled into the arrangement with a kind of resigned acceptance, performing the rituals of affection in public while feeling very little in private. And the legal structure of marriage made leaving it, for most people, effectively impossible. The Matrimonial Causes Act of 1857 had introduced civil divorce in England for the first time. Before that, dissolving a marriage required a private act of Parliament, an expensive and humiliating process available only to the very wealthy. After 1857, divorce became marginally more accessible, but only marginally. And the conditions attached to it revealed very clearly exactly what the law thought about the respective positions of men and women within the institution. A man could divorce his wife on the grounds of adultery alone. One instance, one proven act of infidelity. That was sufficient grounds for him to dissolve the marriage, reclaim his social standing, and keep his children. A woman, by contrast, could not divorce her husband on the grounds of adultery alone. She had to prove aggravated adultery, adultery combined with cruelty, or desertion, or incest, or bigamy. In other words, simple infidelity on the part of a husband was not, in the eyes of Victorian law, a serious enough offense to warrant dissolving the marriage. And what a woman lost if her husband did divorce her for her infidelity was almost total. Her children, her home, her social standing, her access to the financial support she had been legally dependent on since the moment she married. Because under the laws that governed married women's property, until the Married Women's Property Acts of 1870 and 1882, a wife owned almost nothing of her own. Her wages, her inherited property, her very legal identity were, upon marriage, absorbed into her husband's. She was, in a very literal legal sense, his. And so when we think about Victorian adultery, when we think about the men and women who risked everything for a secret relationship, for a hidden correspondence, for a love that existed entirely outside the official story of their lives, we need to carry this weight with us. The stakes were not equal. They were never equal. A man who kept a mistress risked social embarrassment if discovered, but rarely much more. A woman who took a lover risked absolutely everything. And yet, they did it anyway, in numbers that would have horrified the respectable surface of Victorian society, had that surface ever truly been forced to confront the reality beneath it. They wrote letters that should have been burned and kept them instead. Bundled in ribbons hidden in desk drawers. They arranged meetings in parks and museums and the back rooms of hotels. They found each other at dinner parties and country house weekends and in the pews of the very churches where they had sworn their vows. The question that pulls at me, and that I want to pull at through this whole long night, is not simply what they did. It is what it cost them to want it, what it cost them to reach across the rigid structures of their world for something that felt real. Because in a society that polished its surfaces to such a high shine, Desire was always the thing that told the truth. And we are only just beginning to look at what that truth contains. Stay with me, because the next part of this story takes us deeper into the architecture of Victorian marriage itself, into the private rooms of some of its most respectable households, and into the slow, quiet realization that many of the people inside those marriages were living lives of extraordinary emotional isolation. And isolation, as anyone who has ever felt it knows, has a way of making even the most unlikely door look like a way out. The relationship between Victorian households and their servants around matters of private life is one of the most complex and most underexplored aspects of the whole subject. Servants occupied an extraordinary position. They were present at the most intimate moments of their employers' lives, and they were required to process what they observed with a comprehensive professional silence. But professional silence is not the same as indifference. Servants had opinions. They formed alliances and antipathies. They talked in the kitchens and the servants' halls about what they saw. They shared information with other servants in neighboring households. They sometimes disclosed what they knew when the conditions seemed right, when they felt mistreated, when they were asked to carry correspondence they found uncomfortable, when they were offered money to confirm what someone already suspected. The butler who admitted a particular visitor on particular afternoons and chose not to mention the visits to his employer when his employer returned. The lady's maid who dressed her mistress for an assignation she recognized but did not name. The housekeeper who managed the scheduling of the household in ways that created and protected the spaces in which certain things could happen. These were not passive figures. They were active participants in the management of the hidden life, and they often had their own complex relationship to the moral questions involved. Some servants clearly disapproved. Their employer's moral failings confirmed everything the respectable domestic ideology had told them about the corruption of the upper classes, and they maintained their own sense of moral superiority with some satisfaction. Others were more pragmatic. A household where the employer's private satisfactions were being met outside the marriage was sometimes a more peaceable workplace than one where the frustrations had no outlet. And others were genuinely sympathetic. The woman servant who identified with her mistress's situation, who understood something of what it felt like to live without autonomy, who carried messages and kept secrets out of something that looked, in its own limited and constrained way, like solidarity. The world of the Victorian servant is the world through which all Victorian private life passed. They were the necessary intermediaries, the people through whose hands the letters went, and in whose presence the preparations happened, and their perspective on what they observed, mostly lost, rarely recorded in forms that survived, would constitute, if we had it, one of the richest sources we could have for understanding what Victorian hidden life actually felt like from close proximity. Think for a moment about what it would feel like to be very lonely inside a very full house. Not lonely in the obvious way, not abandoned, not neglected in any visible sense, but lonely in the way that is much harder to name, the loneliness of sharing a life with someone you do not truly know, of sleeping beside a person who is a stranger to your inner world, of performing intimacy so completely, so consistently that you begin to lose track of where the performance ends and the real feeling begins. This was, for a significant proportion of Victorian married people, the texture of daily life. Not all of them, certainly. History is always more complicated than its generalizations, and there were Victorian marriages of genuine warmth, genuine partnership, genuine mutual understanding. People fell in love and remained in love. People built lives together that were, in the deepest sense, shared. We should not overwrite those realities with a darker story than the evidence supports. But the structure of Victorian marriage, the legal architecture of it, the social expectations surrounding it, the speed at which it was often contracted, and the limitations on what could be felt or expressed or negotiated within it, created conditions in which emotional isolation was not the exception. It was, for many people, the norm. Consider how marriages actually began. A young woman of the middle or upper classes would typically spend several years in a period the Victorians called being out. She had been formally introduced into adult social society, the season of balls, dinner parties, afternoon calls, and carefully managed social encounters that constituted the marriage market. She was expected during this period to be charming, to be well presented, to attract appropriate male attention without appearing to seek it. She was not supposed to know very much about the man she eventually agreed to marry. Prolonged courtship was unusual. Extended periods of private conversation between an unmarried couple were chaperoned or avoided entirely. And so she married someone she had met in drawing rooms, someone with whom she had exchanged pleasantries and perhaps danced, and perhaps walked in a garden with a chaperone at a careful distance. She had very little access to his actual character. She did not know what he was like when he was angry, or frightened, or disappointed. She did not know his private opinions, his secret fears, his unguarded thoughts. She had seen the performance he put on for public consumption, and on the basis of that performance, she had agreed to spend the rest of her life with him. He, for his part, knew equally little about her. He had seen her at her most carefully managed. He had seen the version of herself she had been trained from girlhood to present in public. Pleasant, gentle, accomplished, not too clever, and not too serious. He had not seen her intelligence in full. He had not seen her frustration or her ambition or her private opinions about the world. He had seen the angel, not the person behind the angel. And then the door closed, and the social event was over, and they were alone together. What happened next varied enormously. Some people discovered, in that privacy, something they genuinely liked in each other. The performance fell away, and something real emerged. Friendship, attraction, the slow building of actual trust. These were the lucky ones, and they existed. But for many others, the privacy revealed only what the public presentation had been concealing. The man who had seemed charming in society was cold in private. The woman who had seemed gentle was simply submerged, her real self so thoroughly trained out of her public behavior that even she had almost forgotten what it looked like. And they were bound together, legally, financially, socially, inescapably bound. What fascinates me about the emotional geography of Victorian marriage is the way it was organized by silence. Not the silence of people who have nothing to say to each other, but the silence of people who have been taught that certain things cannot be said at all. Certain feelings had no legitimate language in Victorian middle-class life. Dissatisfaction with one's marriage was one of them. To admit that your marriage was unhappy was to admit a kind of failure, not just personal failure, but moral failure. It suggested that you had not tried hard enough, had not been good enough, had not performed the duties of wife or husband with sufficient devotion. It reflected poorly on your family, on your upbringing, on your character. And for a woman, it carried an additional danger. To criticize your husband, even in private, was to risk being labeled difficult, unstable, ungrateful. These were not labels anyone could afford. And so couples maintained the surface. They appeared at the same dinner tables, sat in the same church pews, presented the same composed front to the same social world. And inside that composed front, privately, separately, they lived in whatever emotional space they had managed to carve out for themselves. One of the most striking accounts of this reality comes not from a scandalous memoir or a court record, but from something as ordinary as a private diary. Countless Victorian women kept diaries, partly because it was considered a respectable accomplishment, partly because it was one of the very few spaces in which honesty was permitted. And what those diaries reveal, when scholars have had access to them, is a portrait of inner lives almost entirely invisible in the public record. Women writing about the disappointment of husbands who turned out to be different from what they had expected. Women writing about the loneliness of long evenings spent in silence. Women writing about longing, not always for another specific person, but for something, some unnamed thing that the life they were actually living did not contain. And the men's private correspondence sometimes tells a parallel story. The man who is witty and expansive in his letters to friends, but who barely speaks at his own dinner table. The man who visits his club every evening and stays until late, not out of particular enthusiasm for billiards or port, but because he does not particularly want to go home. These were the conditions inside which extramarital desire grew, not in most cases as a sudden eruption, not as a deliberate act of rebellion, but slowly, gradually, almost without decision, as a response to the particular quality of loneliness that comes from being legally joined to someone who is emotionally a stranger. There is one more coded language I want to spend time with, because it is perhaps the strangest and most beautiful of all the instruments Victorian desire produced. The love token. The Victorians were extraordinary makers of intimate objects, small, handcrafted, sometimes extraordinarily elaborate tokens exchanged between people in relationships of various kinds. Mourning jewelry made from the hair of the dead is probably the most famous example, and it sounds, from a contemporary perspective, more than a little macabre. But the impulse behind it was one we recognize completely, the desire to hold something real, something bodily, something that partook of the actual physical existence of the person being mourned or loved. The same impulse operated in the exchange of love tokens, locks of hair pressed and sealed in a locket, miniature portraits, small enough to be worn beneath clothing, out of sight, rings with secret messages engraved on their inner surfaces, invisible when worn but present always against the skin, handkerchiefs embroidered with initials in colors that only the recipient would understand, books with passages marked in pencil that communicated, to someone who knew to look, a message invisible to anyone else. These objects are, in the material culture of Victorian hidden desire, some of the most moving artifacts that survive. They were made to be hidden. They were worn against the body, or kept in locked drawers, or hidden in the bindings of books. They were the material form of the emotional double life, the thing that could be touched and held and felt in the body, even when the person it represented was absent, even when the situation that produced it had to exist in perfect concealment. What I find most striking about them, when I hold this thought carefully, is their intimacy. In a world that managed physical closeness with extraordinary carefulness, that had rules about touching, about proximity, about the appropriate distance between bodies in social space, these small hidden objects were a form of continuous physical contact, the locket worn against the heart, the ring on the finger beneath the glove, a presence maintained in the body's own warmth, private and constant and entirely real. This is the Victorian hidden life at its most human. Not the dramatic scandal or the courtroom disaster or the newspaper headline, but a woman alone in a quiet house, holding a small object in her hand that connects her across whatever distance and whatever silence the world has imposed to something that she knows, perhaps the only thing she knows entirely without performance, to be real. The diaries deserve a closer look than we have yet given them. Victorian diary keeping was a widespread practice, particularly among women of the middle classes, and the diaries that survive constitute one of the richest sources we have for understanding the inner life of the era. Not the published diaries, carefully edited for posthumous respectability, but the private ones, the ones with locks, the ones hidden in hat boxes, the ones written in a hand so small that reading them requires a glass, as though the writing itself were trying to make itself invisible. In those diaries, the hidden life speaks with a directness available nowhere else. Not directly, always. Victorian diarists were also careful, also aware that discovery was possible. But in the texture of the language, in the small eruptions of feeling beneath the surface of domestic notation, in the passage that suddenly accelerates into something raw and then composes itself back into careful prose, in these textures, the inner life insists on its existence. A woman noting in the margin of an entry about household accounts, a date circled in pencil. Another woman who writes about the weather on a particular Tuesday with such careful attention that it is clear something happened that Tuesday that cannot be described in any other terms. Another who records a visit to an exhibition and describes a painting in 2 dense paragraphs and then writes, in a different ink that suggests the entry was returned to later, I cannot describe what I mean. I will leave it as it is. These are the documents of a civilization living in 2 registers at once, the register of the stated and the register of the meant, the register of what could be written down and the register of what pressed against the surface of what could be written, trying to find form. Now, into this landscape, we need to introduce a figure that Victorian society acknowledged and yet refused to acknowledge, a figure who existed everywhere and was discussed nowhere. The kept mistress. The arrangement of a mistress was, for Victorian men of the upper and upper middle classes, something close to an open secret, not openly discussed in mixed company, not acknowledged in the formal social record, but known by other men, known by servants, sometimes tacitly known by the wife herself, though to acknowledge that knowledge would have been its own kind of social catastrophe. The mistress occupied a strange position in the social architecture. She was typically, though not always, a woman of lower social standing than the wife. She might be an actress, a governess, a shop girl, a widow of reduced circumstances. She had, or was understood to have fewer social protections, fewer options, fewer defenses. She received financial support, an apartment, an allowance, gifts in exchange for companionship, affection, and the kind of unconstrained emotional intimacy that the formal structure of marriage made almost impossible. And here is something I find genuinely striking about this arrangement. When you look at it from the inside rather than the outside, the mistress was often given something the wife was not. She was given the permission to be herself. Not in any formal sense, not with any legal protection or social recognition, but in the intimate space between two people, she was allowed to have opinions, to be clever, to be amusing, to disagree, to be imperfect. She was not required to be an angel. She was simply required to be present and engaged and real, which tells you something rather devastating about the wife. The wife, with all her legal status and social recognition, with the ring on her finger and the name on the household accounts, was required to be less than a full human being. She was required to erase the very qualities, the intelligence, the individuality, the honest emotional response that might have made her genuinely compelling to the man she lived with. And the man went elsewhere to find what the institution of marriage had forbidden him to receive at home. This is not an apology for adultery. It is something more uncomfortable than that. It is an observation about a system so profoundly distorted in its demands that it almost inevitably produced the failure it most feared. There is another dimension to this that I want to hold for a moment before we move on. The emotional isolation of Victorian marriage was not experienced the same way by men and women, and understanding the difference matters. For a Victorian man of the middle or upper class, emotional isolation within marriage was uncomfortable but rarely disabling. He had resources that his wife did not. He had the club, that remarkable institution of Victorian masculine sociability that served simultaneously as a refuge from domestic life, a professional network, a space for genuine intellectual exchange, and, not infrequently, a staging ground for extramarital arrangements. He could spend his evenings there without social censure. He was expected to have a life that extended beyond the home. He also had his profession, which gave him a structured identity and a sphere of competence entirely separate from the marriage. A man who was failing as a husband could nevertheless be succeeding as a lawyer, a businessman, a civil servant. His sense of himself was not entirely dependent on the state of his domestic arrangements. A woman had none of these alternative structures. Her identity was her marriage. The home was not merely where she lived. It was, in the social logic of the era, what she was. A woman who was failing at marriage, or whose marriage was failing, had nothing to retreat into, no alternative sphere of accomplishment, no public identity that existed independently of her role as wife and mother. The emotional stakes of the marriage, therefore, were simply higher for her. More was riding on it. More of her inner life was staked to it. And so when it failed to provide what she needed, the connection, the recognition, the sense of being genuinely known, the deprivation was more total. This is, I think, part of why the letters that survive from Victorian women conducting secret relationships have the particular quality that they do. They are not simply the record of pleasure or excitement, though they are sometimes that too. They are the record of people who have found in a forbidden space something that the permitted space was failing to provide. Not just desire, but recognition. not just passion, but the particular relief of being for once genuinely seen. By the middle decades of Victoria's reign, the double life had become something close to a structural feature of upper-class masculine existence. A man might have a wife in the country house and a mistress in a fashionable London apartment, and the two worlds would exist in careful, maintained parallel, never overlapping, never acknowledged, never disturbed by the inconvenience of honest reckoning. There were, of course, women who knew and chose silence, wives who understood perfectly well what their husbands were doing and decided, with extraordinary clarity and practicality, that the social and financial costs of confrontation were simply too high, that the home, the children, the social position were worth more than the scene that truth would make. And so they said nothing. They continued to appear at the dinner table, to sit in the church pew, to manage the household, to present the composed surface. And underneath that surface, what? Grief, perhaps? Resignation? The particular kind of dignity that comes from making peace with something you cannot change, or in some cases something more active and more interesting, their own private rebellion, their own small reclamation of a life that was supposed to belong entirely to someone else. Because the desire for something real, for something felt, for something that moved beneath the surface, that was not in the end a masculine quality, it was a human one. And we will spend the next part of this long night exploring exactly that, the elaborate, intricate, often surprising language that Victorian people, men and women, across the layers of their society, developed for the expression of a desire that could never be spoken directly. Because in a world where nothing could be said plainly, everything had to be said in code. And some of those codes, when you learn to read them, are heartbreaking in their beauty. In a world where nothing could be said plainly, everything had to be said in code. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine it. You are standing in a Victorian drawing room at a late afternoon gathering, surrounded by the careful noise of polite conversation. Teacups clink softly against saucers. Someone is playing something gentle on the piano in the corner. The light is low and amber, coming through heavy curtains. Across the room, there is a person. And in that room full of people, every word you could possibly say to that person has to be composed, measured, acceptable. There is nothing you can say directly, and yet you watch them pick up a small posy of flowers from the arrangement on the side table, a red rose half open. They hold it for just a moment too long before setting it down. And if you know the language, if you have studied as many educated Victorians did, the elaborate symbolic vocabulary of flowers, you understand that someone has left a message where nothing could be spoken. Floriography, the language of flower. It sounds like a charming Victorian eccentricity, a piece of decorative sentiment, something to smile at from a comfortable distance. But inside a culture where desire had to be coded, where the direct expression of feeling was socially forbidden, it was something rather more serious than that. It was one of the primary languages through which inadmissible things were communicated between people who had no other means of saying them. Victorian floriography had a remarkably sophisticated vocabulary. Red roses, of course, love, but the gradations mattered enormously. A single red rose meant I love you. A rose in bud meant a confession of love from someone young or innocent. A withered rose was something quite different, a statement that love was dying or already dead. Yellow roses in the Victorian convention could mean jealousy or friendship or the particular bitterness of a love that had gone wrong. Ivy meant fidelity. Forget-me-nots meant exactly what they seemed to mean. Pansies came from the French word penser, thought, and meant I am thinking of you. Violet suggested modesty and constancy. Lavender spoke of distrust. A sprig of rosemary laid beside a letter was a message of remembrance, of a love not yet relinquished. And the arrangements mattered too. A flower handed upright was an affirmation. The same flower handed upside down reversed its meaning entirely. A flower touching the lips meant yes. The same flower touching the heart deepened the declaration. What I find so quietly astonishing about this system is the way it reveals the intensity of the need it was designed to serve. People do not develop sophisticated codes unless they genuinely need them. This was not a parlor game. This was a living vocabulary developed by and for people who had feelings they were not permitted to express in any direct way, and who found in the language of flowers a means of communication that carried plausible deniability. If intercepted or discovered, a bouquet was merely a bouquet. Only the intended recipient would know that the arrangement of white carnations and dark ivy and a single half-open red rose was a complete sentence, private, precise, absolutely meaningful. The geography of Victorian desire had another dimension that I want to spend some time in. The seaside resort and the country house, those specifically Victorian inventions that functioned whether or not this was their intended purpose, as spaces where the rules of ordinary social life applied rather differently. The Victorian seaside resort emerged as a phenomenon in the middle decades of the century, partly as a consequence of the railways that made the coast accessible to the middle classes for the first time. Brighton, Ramsgate, Scarborough, Torquay, these places attracted during the summer months a population in transit, removed from their ordinary social surveillance, thrown together in a temporary community of strangers and acquaintances, and people whose connections to each other were not quite what they appeared to be at home. The bathing machine, that elaborate Victorian device for managing the public exposure of the female body at the seaside, a wheeled hut that allowed women to enter the water without being visible from the beach, is sometimes cited as an example of Victorian prudishness carried to absurdity. But the behavior happening inside those resorts, in the lodging houses and the assembly rooms and the promenades and the gardens, was rather less prudish than the bathing machine suggests. The temporary community of the resort was one in which flirtation was understood to be part of the entertainment, in which the ordinary rules about chaperonage and social surveillance were applied with rather less rigor than in the city, and in which a surprising number of Victorian relationships, including a significant number that went considerably beyond flirtation, appear to have begun or been conducted. The country house weekend performed a similar function at the aristocratic level. A house party of 20 or 30 guests brought together for a week of hunting and dining and card games and conversation, organized its sleeping arrangements in ways that were at the level of the servants and the hostess who did the actual room allocation, sometimes frankly arranged with an awareness of who was currently involved with whom. The hostess of a successful country house in the 1880s or 1890s was, among her other social skills, a skilled manager of the discreet logistics of a guest list that might include several pairs of people connected by relationships that had no official status. This was not true of every house party or every hostess, but it was sufficiently common, sufficiently documented in memoirs and letters and the anecdotes that circulate in historical accounts of the period to constitute a genuine feature of upper-class Victorian social life. The country house weekend was, among other things, one of the primary institutional settings in which Victorian adultery organized itself. What I find genuinely interesting about this, rather than merely scandalous, is what it tells us about the way societies manage the gap between their official values and their actual practices. Victorian England did not simply suppress desire, it created spaces, physical and social spaces, in which desire could be managed in controlled conditions. The seaside resort, the country house, the club, the theater, the spaces of temporary community and temporary anonymity that the modern world was multiplying, these were not accidental. They were, in some sense, the infrastructure that a society with an extremely demanding official morality required in order to maintain that morality in the spaces where it was most publicly necessary, by providing release valves in the spaces that were less visible. Every strict society has its release valves. The ones that Victorian England built were distinctive to its time and class structure, but the underlying logic, the displacement of what cannot be accommodated in the center of social life to the margins, the borders, the temporary spaces, is as old as organized human society itself. The fan served a similar function. Women of the Victorian middle and upper classes carried fans, and the way a fan was held or moved carried a whole secondary vocabulary that existed in plain sight. A fan held open in front of the face meant "I love you." Closed suddenly was "I wish to speak with you." Drawn across the cheek was "I love you." Again, but in a gesture rather than an object. A fan resting against the left cheek, yes. Against the right, no. Twirling in the left hand meant we are being watched. We are being watched. There is a whole civilization's anxiety compressed into that gesture. The constant awareness of observation, of surveillance, of the eyes that might be tracking a look held a half second too long, or a hand that lingered when it did not need to. To live a hidden emotional life in Victorian England was to live in a state of perpetual peripheral awareness. And then there were the letters. This is where the hidden lives of Victorian people are most fully recorded, not in official documents or published memoirs, but in private correspondence that was sometimes saved and sometimes burned and sometimes discovered decades after the fact, tucked into the backs of drawers or found pressed between the pages of books. Victorian letter writing was an art form in itself. And for those conducting secret relationships, it became something that had to be both beautiful and careful at once. The carefully coded letter was a Victorian speciality. A couple conducting an affair could not, in most cases, write to each other directly. Letters arrived through household servants, and servants were not always discreet, and wives and husbands sometimes opened each other's correspondence. And so the letters that were preserved often exist in a state of elegant ambiguity, warm to the point of unmistakable feeling, but with the crucial facts either omitted entirely or coded in ways that required the recipient's knowledge to decode. One of the most studied examples of this kind of correspondence involves the Victorian statesman William Gladstone, 4 times Prime Minister, famously upright, famously religious, the very embodiment of Victorian moral seriousness. Gladstone's more ambiguous relationships with various women, including the actress Laura Thistlethwaite, with whom he maintained a long and tender correspondence, and others whose precise nature historians continue to debate, have been debated by historians for well over a century. His habit of conducting what he called rescue work with women of questionable reputation, walking the streets of London at night, approaching women involved in prostitution, attempting to offer them paths toward respectability, was, depending on your interpretation, either genuine Christian charity or something considerably more complicated. His letters are warm, tender, sometimes surprisingly intimate in tone, and almost never explicit. They exist in exactly the space the Victorian coded letter was designed to occupy, saying much while proving nothing. He was not unusual in this. The preservation of plausible deniability was one of the defining skills of the Victorian extramarital relationship, and the letter, with its capacity for emotional intensity without explicit confession, was its primary instrument. But not everyone was careful, and it is the cases where caution failed, where a letter was kept too long, or found by the wrong person, or read by a servant who understood more than expected, that give us the clearest glimpse into the actual emotional content of what was happening behind the composure. One such letter, preserved in a private collection and published in the early 20th century by a discreet family historian, runs for several pages and describes nothing explicitly illicit. It speaks of a meeting at an exhibition, of a particular piece of music heard together, of an afternoon that the writer describes as the one real afternoon in a year of performing. That phrase, the one real afternoon in a year of performing, is as complete a description of a hidden life as I have ever encountered. It tells you everything about the emotional texture of the existence this person was living. The public life as performance, the private moment as the thing that is actually felt. The one real afternoon. Imagine carrying that. Imagine building an entire emotional survival strategy around the question of when the next real afternoon would come, marking it in a coded notation in a diary, anticipating it across weeks of dinner parties and church services and household management, holding it privately, carefully, like a flame cupped in both hands against the wind. And alongside the letters and the flowers and the fans, there were the spaces in which encounters could happen. Victorian society was, on the surface, a tightly surveilled social world, but it was also, paradoxically, a world that provided a remarkable number of settings in which its surveillance could be evaded. The great exhibitions and museums of the era were public enough to be respectable, but crowded enough to offer cover. A couple could move through the galleries of the South Kensington Museum, standing before the same painting at the same moment, exchanging a few words under the cover of cultural appreciation. The railway had created the possibility of private journeys in compartments where the usual social observation did not apply. The country house weekend, with its large guest lists and its carefully allocated rooms and its long unstructured afternoons, was practically designed, whether or not this was entirely intentional, for the kind of encounters that could not happen in the city. Parks served as the geography of many an illicit London relationship. The great parks of the capital, Hyde Park, Regent's Park, the quieter reaches of St. James's were public spaces that nonetheless offered, in their more secluded paths and their long tree-lined walks, a degree of privacy unavailable anywhere else. A couple who could not meet in a house could walk together. They could talk. They could, in the language of Victorian emotional expression, simply be present to each other in a way that the social architecture of the drawing room did not allow. And I think it is worth pausing here to feel the particular quality of that, the desperate preciousness of simply being present to someone, of having, even for an hour, the experience of being known, of not performing, of not managing the surface. Just the unguarded fact of two people in the same space, feeling what they felt, without the requirement that it be composed into something acceptable. In a society so thoroughly organized around performance, that kind of presence was not merely pleasant. It was, for many people, the closest thing to actual life that they could find. The codes and the carefully arranged flowers and the ambiguous letters were not, in the end, merely practical instruments for the management of risk. They were also, and this is what I find most moving about them, a kind of literature, a private literature, mostly unread, mostly destroyed, written by ordinary people with no literary ambitions in the only form available to them. A literature of longing, of coded truth, of feeling that had nowhere else to go. What the Victorian age refused to let be said directly, its people found ways to say anyway. And now we need to look at what happened when the codes failed, when the carefully maintained surfaces finally broke. Because not every hidden thing stayed hidden. Not every letter was burned in time. Not every servant was discreet. And the moment that Victorian society's secret life collided with its public face was one of the most revealing and most merciless moments that era produced. Because the same society that had created the conditions for all this hidden desire was also perfectly prepared to punish its discovery. And it punished it, as we are about to see, with a very specific and very deliberate cruelty, directed with almost perfect consistency at the person who had the least power to begin with. There is a particular kind of injustice that is worst not because it is hidden, but because it is open, because it is acknowledged, even celebrated, as the natural order of things. Because the very people who suffer under it are expected to accept it as reasonable and are provided with no language to contest it. Victorian England's double standard around adultery was that kind of injustice. Let me lay it out plainly before we get into the texture of how it worked in practice, because the plainness of it is important, the starkness of it matters. A Victorian man who committed adultery risked, if discovered, some social embarrassment. He might face the disapproval of his peers. He might find himself temporarily avoided in certain drawing rooms. If the scandal was serious enough, if it ended up in the newspapers or, worse, in the divorce courts, he might suffer real professional consequences. But he would, in almost all cases, recover. Society had built in for men a mechanism of recovery. A period of ostracism, followed by gradual rehabilitation, followed by a return to full social participation. His name was restored. His career continued. He remarried, often with relative ease. A Victorian woman who committed adultery and was discovered, or even suspected, faced something entirely different. She was ruined. Not temporarily, not with the possibility of recovery, ruined in the complete, comprehensive, life-altering sense of the word. She was removed from respectable society. She was no longer received in the homes of people who wished to maintain their own respectability. Her name became unspeakable in polite circles. If divorced, she lost her children. The courts almost invariably awarded custody to the father in cases of proven maternal adultery, regardless of any other considerations. She lost her financial support. She lost her social identity. And the children she was separated from were taught, very often, to regard her with shame. The law, as I touched on earlier, made this asymmetry explicit, but it is worth spending a moment on the specific human experience of the Victorian divorce court, because it was one of the most public and most brutal instruments of the double standard, and the cases it produced tell us a great deal about the actual functioning of a system built on profoundly unequal foundations. The divorce courts, after the 1857 Act, became something that Victorian England had not quite anticipated: a theater. The cases were reported in the newspapers with extraordinary detail. The Times, the Daily Telegraph, the illustrated papers, they covered divorce proceedings with an attentiveness that made them, for many readers, a kind of serial fiction, except that the people involved were real and the consequences for them were permanent. And the cases were not reported neutrally. The woman in a divorce case was typically portrayed in one of two ways. If she was the petitioner, if she was the wife attempting to divorce an abusive or adulterous husband, she was often painted as either a sympathetic victim or a troublesome and insubordinate wife who had failed in her duties of acceptance and endurance. If she was the respondent, the wife accused of adultery, she was painted as a fallen woman, a moral catastrophe, a threat to the sacred institution around which Victorian civilization claimed to organize itself. The men in these cases were treated quite differently. A husband who had kept a mistress for years, who had neglected his wife and all but forced her into emotional isolation, who was guilty of exactly the same infidelity he was charging his wife with committing, that man was treated by the courts and by the newspapers as the injured party, the wronged husband, the man whose domestic peace had been violated, whose name had been tarnished, whose social standing deserved the protection of the law. The language used in these proceedings is, from our vantage point, almost surreal in its inconsistency. The same judge might, in the same session, condemn a woman in the most devastating moral terms for a single act of adultery while granting a decree to a man who had maintained a second household for a decade. This was not hypocrisy in the personal sense, not the private vice of individual judges or journalists. It was systemic. It was what the system was designed to produce. And the people operating within it mostly did not experience themselves as being hypocritical at all. They believed, with a sincerity that we need to take seriously if we are to understand them, that the stakes were genuinely different, that female chastity and female fidelity were the foundations of something crucial, the certainty of paternity, the stability of the family unit, the moral example required for the proper raising of children. That to excuse a woman's infidelity was to strike at the very foundation of social order in a way that excusing a man's was not. This logic was wrong, and it was cruel, and it destroyed lives, but it was not thoughtless. It was a coherent position, arrived at deliberately, and defended with intellectual seriousness by the most educated and influential people in the culture, which is, in some ways, more chilling than if it had simply been thoughtless. The Victorian courtroom, in divorce cases involving adultery, was a space with its own elaborate performance conventions, a theater, as I said earlier, but one with very specific staging requirements and a very specific set of roles that the participants were expected to play. The wronged husband was expected to be dignified in his injury, not vindictive, not emotional. These qualities would have undermined the impression of rational grievance that the proceedings required him to project. He was there to reclaim a property right and a social standing, and the best way to do this was to present himself as the kind of man whose property right and social standing deserved protection. Controlled, reasonable, the injured party of a respectable household, not a man in the grip of jealousy or rage. The wife who was the respondent, the woman accused of adultery, occupied an almost impossible position in terms of performance. If she was too emotional, she appeared unstable, further confirming the implied narrative that she was not fit for the role she had failed. If she was too composed, she appeared cold, unfeminine, insufficiently distressed by her situation in a way that itself read as suspicious. The correct register was a kind of dignified grief, sadness without excess, composure without coldness, and it had to be maintained across proceedings that were designed by the opposing legal team to break it. The barristers in these cases were skilled at exactly this, at asking questions that contained their own accusation, at building through the accumulation of small details an impression of a woman who had been leading a life of secret transgression, even in cases where the actual evidence was ambiguous or circumstantial. They understood that the jury, and these cases were tried before juries, was not simply weighing evidence. It was making a judgment about character, about whether this woman was the kind of woman who could have done what she was accused of. And the assessment of what kind of woman was capable of adultery was made partly on the basis of class, partly on the basis of demeanor, and partly on the basis of what one barrister of the period called, with unsettling candor, the general impression of her femininity. A woman who seemed entirely feminine in the approved Victorian sense, gentle, domestic, self-effacing, appropriately distressed, was somewhat less likely to be found guilty than one who projected any quality that read as independent, assertive, or insufficiently submissive. This was not conscious bias in the sense that the juries deliberately thought, "We will acquit women who perform femininity correctly." It was something more diffuse and more deeply embedded than that. It was the operation of a cultural assumption so thoroughly internalized that it presented itself as simple common sense. Good women do not do this. This woman does not seem like a good woman. Therefore, the logic was circular and it was powerful, and it operated in Victorian courtrooms with a consistency that should trouble us even from this distance. What I keep returning to when I think about the Victorian divorce court as an institution is the question of what it was actually for, what social function it performed, and I think the answer is not quite what it presented itself as being. It presented itself as a mechanism for the adjudication of legal disputes about the dissolution of marriages, but what it actually was in many of its most significant cases was a ritual, a public ceremony by which Victorian society performed its own moral commitments, enacted its own values, demonstrated to itself and to its observers the consequences of departing from the code. The specific legal outcome of any given case was less important in this reading than the performance of the process itself. The proceeding announced, regardless of its verdict, that Victorian society took its moral commitments seriously, that transgression would be examined, that the hidden life would, when discovered, be brought into the light and subjected to the full weight of official scrutiny. The ritual was the message, and the message was, this is what it cost. The operation of the Victorian double standard can be traced not just in the famous cases but in the texture of everyday social management, in the small, constant, collective acts by which Victorian society enforced its asymmetric moral code without ever quite acknowledging that the asymmetry was the point. Consider the institution of the social call. In Victorian middle-class life, social calls were a primary mechanism of both connection and surveillance. Women made calls and received calls, maintained visiting lists, exchanged cards. And the decision of whether to call on a particular woman, whether to include her in your visiting list, whether to accept her invitation, was one of the primary instruments by which the moral community policed itself. A woman whose reputation was under any suspicion would find her visiting list shrinking, quietly, without confrontation, without anyone being required to explain themselves. Women who had previously called would simply not call again. Invitations that had previously been accepted would begin to be declined. The social world would contract, imperceptibly at first and then with increasing finality around her. This process had a name, used privately but rarely publicly. It was called being cut, and it was, for women of the Victorian middle and upper classes, one of the most feared social consequences imaginable, not because it was dramatically violent or legally catastrophic, but because it was so total. To be cut was to be removed from the network of social life that constituted, in many ways, a Victorian woman's entire daily existence. No calls, no visits. No access to the community of women whose conversation and support and shared domestic life filled the hours between one domestic duty and the next. And crucially, it required no proof. Rumor was sufficient. Suspicion was sufficient. The mere association with a name or a situation that smelled of scandal was sufficient. A woman did not need to have done anything for the process to begin. She needed only to be suspected. A man in the same situation faced a significantly different social response. Male clubs operated on a different social logic from the female visiting network. A man might find himself temporarily avoided, might encounter a certain coolness in certain quarters. But the male social world was organized around professional identity and shared interest in ways that made it considerably more resistant to the kind of comprehensive social withdrawal that the female visiting network could impose. Men had more places to go, more identities to fall back on, more social contexts in which their romantic or sexual history was simply not the relevant variable. The poet and critic Anna Jameson, writing in the 1850s, put the asymmetry with a precision that must have seemed almost dangerous for the era. The same society that requires absolute chastity of its daughters, she observed, provides its sons with every opportunity and inducement to make that requirement impossible for women to meet. She was referring to a specific mechanism, the existence of a class of women, the kept mistress, the woman of what the era called easy virtue, whose existence depended precisely on the fact that men of the respectable classes sought them out. Those women had not materialized from nowhere. They existed because the demand existed. And the demand was generated by the same men who were the fathers and brothers and husbands of the women whose virtue the system was supposedly designed to protect. The morality, in other words, was eating itself. The very men whose daughters' purity the code was designed to enforce were the men whose appetites the code's other half was quietly serving. This was known. It was not a secret in any meaningful sense. It was simply a truth that the official narrative declined to examine directly, because to examine it directly would be to acknowledge that the system was not, in fact, a moral code at all. It was a distribution of risk, a mechanism for determining who would bear the costs of the arrangement and who would enjoy its benefits. And the answer, with a consistency that should startle us even now, was always the same. The costs fell on women, the benefits accumulated to men. What this meant in practice was a world organized around the need to conceal female desire, absolutely. Not male desire that was given its outlets, its acknowledged spaces, its quiet acceptance, but female desire was not permitted to have a face, a voice, a narrative, a legitimate existence in any form. And so when it existed anyway, and it did exist persistently, insistently, regardless of what the law or the sermon or the conduct manual said about it, it had to be managed in a state of perfect invisibility. A woman conducting a secret relationship in Victorian England had none of the infrastructure that made the same project for a man relatively manageable. A man could maintain a second household. He could use his club as cover for his whereabouts. He could rely on the fact that society was not particularly motivated to look too closely at what he was doing, because what he was doing was not ultimately the kind of thing society felt required to destroy. A woman had none of these protections. She operated within a social world that was, on some level, constitutively suspicious of her, because the entire moral architecture of the era was built on the premise that female virtue was fragile and required constant management and surveillance. Any departure from the expected script of angelic domesticity was noticed. Any unexplained absence attracted attention. Any letter, any meeting, any friendship with a man who was not her husband required justification. And yet, here is the thing that the simple story of female victimization in Victorian adultery often leaves out. The thing I most want to bring into focus tonight. The women who navigated this system, who found their way through its impossible demands to something that felt to them genuinely worth the risk, were not passive. They were not simply swept away by forces they did not understand. Many of them made decisions with a clarity and deliberateness that the era did everything in its power to prevent women from possessing. They chose. Under conditions of radical inequality and enormous danger, they looked at what they were risking and made a choice. And that choice, the act of choosing, inside a system designed to prevent choice, is one of the most quietly remarkable things in the whole history of Victorian private life. Consider the case of Lady Colin Campbell, whose divorce proceedings in 1886 became one of the most extensively reported scandals of the late Victorian era. Lady Colin, born Gertrude Elizabeth Blood, an Irish beauty of considerable intelligence and genuine literary ambition, had married Lord Colin Campbell, the youngest son of the Duke of Argyll, in 1881. The marriage was a disaster almost from the beginning. Lord Colin had contracted syphilis before the marriage, a fact concealed from his wife, and the physical and emotional consequences for her were profound. By the time the marriage reached the divorce courts 5 years later, both parties were filing charges against the other. Lord Colin accused his wife of adultery with 4 different men. Lady Colin accused her husband of the same charge with a household servant. The case became a national sensation, reported in such breathless detail that it inspired, among other things, a board game, one of the more grotesque artifacts of Victorian scandal culture. What strikes me about Lady Colin Campbell's position in that courtroom is not the lurid detail that the newspapers found so compelling. It is the quality of her resistance. She fought back. She refused the role of the quietly ruined woman accepting her fate. She contested her husband's claims with a fierceness and a public confidence that was, in itself, a kind of transgression against the norms of feminine conduct, because a woman who defended herself that actively was stepping outside the script she was supposed to follow. She was ultimately found not guilty of the charges against her. She went on to build a career as a journalist and art critic, one of the first women to do so at a serious professional level. She refused to disappear. And she paid for her refusal anyway, because in Victorian society, simply having been at the center of such a case, regardless of the verdict, regardless of the evidence, was enough. The association with scandal was itself contaminating. She was never fully readmitted to the social world she had occupied before the trial. The verdict could say not guilty. Society said something else. This gap between the formal verdict and the social reality, between what was legally established and what was culturally felt, is one of the most revealing spaces in the whole landscape of Victorian adultery. It tells you exactly where the real power lay, not in the law, finally, but in the drawing room. Not in the judge's ruling, but in whether your neighbor's wife was willing to continue receiving you. And it is that social power, informal, invisible, exercised through the small decisions of hundreds of individuals acting in concert without any formal coordination, that we need to hold in mind as we move into the next chapter of this story. Because now we need to look at the actual human beings who became the public faces of Victorian scandal. The ones whose hidden lives broke through the surface in ways that could no longer be contained. The ones the newspapers named, the ones history remembers, and the ones rather more numerous that history has allowed to quietly disappear. Because scandal in Victorian England, like most things in Victorian England, was not distributed equally. It fell on certain people with crushing force, and on others it barely settled at all. And the difference between the ones who were destroyed and the ones who recovered has almost everything to do with gender, with class, and with the particular question of who got to write the story afterward. History remembers certain names and forgets others. This is always true, and it is never quite accidental. The names that survived the Victorian scandal, that were preserved and recorded and analyzed and debated across the century that followed, were almost always the names of men. Men of talent, of fame, of social position. Men for whom history felt an explanatory interest, a biographical investment. Their affairs and their disasters became footnotes in larger narratives about their genius, their ambition, their complicated relationship with the moral frameworks of their time. The women in those stories, the women who loved them, who were loved by them, who were destroyed or transformed or simply quietly sidelined by the consequences of what they shared with those famous men, were recorded as accessories, secondary figures, the presence that explains a gap in a biography, the name that appears briefly and then recedes. Tonight I want to hold both of these stories, the famous names and the almost forgotten ones, in the same frame, because together they tell something more complete than either tells alone. Let us begin with the most famous case of creative scandal in the Victorian era, Charles Dickens, by the 1850s, was the most celebrated novelist in the English language. His face was one of the most recognized in England. His fiction had defined, for millions of readers, the moral landscape of the age, the cruelty of poverty, the corruption of institutions, the redemptive power of love and decency and human warmth. He had built, through his writing, a reputation as a champion of the vulnerable and a voice for the values the Victorians claimed to hold most dear. And in 1858, he left his wife of 22 years and began what would become a sustained, serious, and carefully concealed relationship with a young actress named Ellen Ternan. Ellen was 18 when she met Dickens. He was 45. She had grown up in the theatrical world, which placed her in the social imagination of Victorian England in a category of women already considered to be of ambiguous virtue. The theater was associated with display, with performance, with a kind of public visibility that respectable women were supposed to avoid. She was intelligent, and she was young, and she appears to have understood very clearly what it meant to become what she became, the private companion of a married, famous, publicly pious man. What her private feelings about this arrangement were is a question that has occupied scholars for generations and to which we do not have a clean answer. She outlived Dickens by 45 years, and she spent those years in a state of careful concealment. She told her children almost nothing about her years with him. When she died, her family destroyed a significant portion of her papers. The woman who had been the central emotional reality of Charles Dickens's last 14 years erased herself from the record as thoroughly as Victorian discretion and the fear of posthumous judgment required. Dickens, for his part, managed the public presentation of the separation from his wife with a remarkable combination of ruthlessness and self-justification. He published a statement in Household Words, his own magazine, which he fully controlled, explaining the separation in terms that placed the moral weight of failure firmly on his wife Catherine's side. He characterized her as temperamentally unsuited to marriage and motherhood. He presented himself as a man who had endured an incompatible union with patient forbearance before finally, reluctantly, accepting that the situation was irreparable. This was, by most accounts of people who knew the situation, almost entirely untrue. But Dickens had the platform, the fame, and the extraordinary capacity for narrative self-construction that his genius provided. He told the story his way, and for a considerable period his way was the way that stuck. Catherine Dickens, who had borne him 10 children and managed his household and endured his increasingly difficult temperament through 22 years of marriage, was quietly repositioned from wife to obstacle. She was not ruined in the legal sense. She received a settlement and a house and a small income. But she was removed from his home, from his social life, from the children she had raised, from the story of her own marriage. She spent the rest of her life in a careful obscurity that must have required, when you consider what she had known and what she had lost, a profound and probably exhausting act of self-discipline. She did one thing that I find enormously poignant. She kept his letters, all of them. And before she died, she gave them to the British Museum with a note requesting that they be made available to the public so that the world might know he had loved her, so that his tenderness, his early warmth, his genuine feeling for her in the years before everything changed might be part of the record. Not for revenge, not to destroy his reputation, simply to insist on her own reality. to say, I was here, he loved me, that was real. That act, the careful preservation of love letters given to an archive so that a woman's existence might be acknowledged, is one of the quietly devastating documents of Victorian marriage. Now, against Dickens's story, which history has picked over in extraordinary detail, I want to place another story, one that has no famous name attached to it, but which survives in the records of the Victorian Court of Chancery, the court that handled, among other matters, the wardship of children in disputed family situations. A woman I will call M. Her full name is in the record, but I will leave it partial out of a remnant of courtesy to any descendants who might still exist, appears in these records in 1873. She was the wife of a solicitor in a northern English city. She had, by the evidence of the record, conducted a relationship with a family friend over a period of approximately 3 years. The relationship had been conducted with what sounds, from the depositions, like considerable care, meetings arranged through the cover of visits to a mutual female friend, letters exchanged through a sympathetic servant, a compartment of emotional life maintained entirely separate from the visible surface of a respectable household. It was discovered through a servant's disclosure. The servant, it appears, had been overlooked for a wage increase she felt she deserved, and the disclosure was her response. The information went to M's husband, and within a month the case was in the courts. What is striking about M's case is not its drama. It was, by the standards of the Victorian divorce court, relatively unremarkable. What is striking is the speed, from discovery to legal proceedings to the removal of M from her household and the awarding of custody of her 3 children entirely to her husband. This took less than 3 months. The machine moved very quickly when it was deployed against a woman of no particular social standing or influence. M's further history is simply not in the public record. The trail goes cold after a brief reference to her in her husband's subsequent legal filings. She disappeared into whatever life was available to a woman in her situation, which is to say, very little of what had constituted her life before. No children, no home, no social identity. No name in the newspapers because she was not interesting enough to preserve. History retained Dickens. History forgot M. I want to spend a moment with the specific texture of Victorian newspaper coverage of divorce cases, because there is something in it that goes beyond the simple fact of prurience, though prurience was certainly present and certainly part of what drove the readership. The Victorian Divorce Court report was also, in a strange and complicated way, a form of public education. It was one of the very few spaces in which the actual conditions of Victorian private life were described with any specificity and any honesty. The conduct manuals, the religious tracts, the popular fiction of the improving variety, these described an idealized version of domestic life that bore only a partial resemblance to what was actually happening behind the closed doors of Victorian households. The divorce court report described, in the specific testimony of witnesses and the documented evidence of letters and hotel registers and servants' depositions, what those households were actually like. And what readers found there, those respectable middle-class readers in their respectable middle-class parlors, reading their respectable newspapers, was recognition. Not necessarily recognition of their own situations, though sometimes that too, but recognition of the emotional reality of marriage as they knew it from the inside. The disappointments, the mismatches, the slow drift of incompatibility. The discovery that the person you had married was not, in important ways, the person you had thought you were marrying. The divorce court made visible what the domestic ideology required to remain invisible, and the millions of readers who followed the cases with such avid attention were not, I think, simply voyeurs feeding on the suffering of others. They were people for whom the official narrative of Victorian marriage had not quite aligned with their experience of it, finding in the public exposure of that gap something that felt like truth. This is one of the most interesting functions that scandal has always performed in public life. Not simply the exposure of individual hypocrisy, though that too, but the collective act of acknowledging, in the controlled space of public spectacle, what everyone has privately known and no official discourse has been willing to name. The divorce court as confession, the newspaper as community of the privately knowing, the scandal as the moment when the surface of public morality and the reality of private life finally, briefly, in one specific case, come into visible relation with each other. It is not a comfortable function. It is not entirely honest in its mechanisms. The coverage was selective, sensationalized, shaped by the interests and prejudices of editors and readers. It destroyed specific individuals while leaving the system that produced their situations entirely unexamined. It allowed the readership to feel superior to the people in the cases while recognizing, at some level, the proximity of their own situations to what was being described. But it was, in its way, a form of truth-telling, the only form of public truth-telling about private life that Victorian England's moral framework permitted. And for the people who needed to find in some form some acknowledgement that their experience of that framework was not simply their own personal failure, those newspaper columns were something more than entertainment. They were company. I want to turn now to a very different kind of famous case, a case that troubles the simple narrative of male impunity versus female destruction, not because it disproves that narrative, which the overall weight of evidence abundantly supports, but because it shows us the ways in which class and the particular moral anxieties of the moment could, under certain circumstances, collapse the protection that maleness was supposed to provide. Oscar Wilde, 1895. The trial that became one of the most extensively documented disasters in Victorian literary history. Wilde's situation was different from anything I have described so far in one crucial sense. The relationship at the center of his destruction was not between a man and a woman, but between two men. The criminalization of homosexual acts under the Criminal Law Amendment Act of 1885 placed his desire in a different legal category from adultery, and the consequences were accordingly different. He was not merely divorced or socially ostracized. He was imprisoned. But what the Wilde case illuminates, beyond its own specific circumstances, is the way in which Victorian England's management of hidden desire was ultimately about power and legibility, about which kinds of desire could be maintained in the invisible half of the double world, and which could not. Wilde's error in the social logic of his era was not that he had desires that transgressed the official moral code. Many men did. His error was that he had made those desires legible. He had, with the recklessness that his confidence and his fame and perhaps his genuine belief that he had transcended ordinary consequence had produced, brought the hidden into a visibility it could not survive. The men who maintained mistresses in London apartments were also transgressing the official moral code, but they were doing so in the invisible half of the world, in the space that Victorian society had quietly designated for such things. They had the protection of that invisibility because their desire, while officially forbidden, was understood, accommodated, and ultimately unthreatening to the structures of power. Wilde's desire threatened something different, and Victorian England's response to it was correspondingly different. Not the quiet social management of acceptable transgression, but the full, crushing deployment of the law. He emerged from prison 2 years later, broken in health and in spirit, exiled from England, dead within 3 years of his release. He was 46 years old. His partner, Lord Alfred Douglas, lived until 1945. He spent the decades after Wilde's death constructing and reconstructing his version of events, occupying and vacating various moral positions, publishing memoirs, fighting lawsuits, writing poetry of variable quality. He outlived Wilde by almost half a century and died having never quite settled on how to feel about what had happened. These are the famous stories, the ones that got written down in enough detail to survive, and they tell us something true. But they do not tell us everything. What they leave out is the vast, unrecorded middle, the hundreds of thousands of ordinary Victorian people who conducted their hidden lives with sufficient care that the disaster never came, who wrote the letters that were burned on time, who kept the appointments that left no record, who lived for years or for decades in the careful parallel of a public life and a private one, and who went to their graves with the private one intact. We will never know most of their names. We will never read their coded letters or hold the roses they arranged. We will never know what it felt like from the inside to sustain that extraordinary act of double living across a whole adult life. But we can know this. They existed in numbers that would have astonished the respectable surface of their era. They were not the exception. They were not the moral catastrophe that the sermons described. They were ordinary people navigating impossible emotional conditions with the best instruments available to them. And some of them, the ones I want to move toward now, made choices so deliberate, so clear-eyed, so insistent on the reality of their own feeling, that they deserve something more than the footnote that history has given them. They deserve to be looked at slowly and carefully in their full human complexity, because they were not simply victims of the system, they were its most interesting resistance. The newspaper culture of Victorian England deserves more attention than it usually receives in discussions of Victorian adultery, because it was the medium through which the private lives of some people became public property, and through which the public's appetite for that particular kind of truth was both served and intensified. By the 1860s and 1870s, the popular press had developed what we would recognize, without too much translation, as a modern tabloid sensibility. The technology of cheap printing, combined with rising literacy rates and the distribution networks that the railways made possible, had created a newspaper market that competed fiercely for readers. And what readers wanted, what they had always wanted, in every society with a sufficiently developed communications infrastructure, was other people's private lives. Divorce court reports were the Victorian equivalent of reality television. The cases were covered in detail that the participants would have found excruciating. Specific dates, named hotels, quoted correspondence, the testimony of servants about what they had observed through the keyhole or inferred from the evidence of bed linen. Nothing was too particular. Nothing was beneath the interest of a readership that had been trained by decades of domestic ideology to treat the home as sacred, and that found in the disasters of other people's domestic lives a satisfaction that the ideology itself would have been hard-pressed to explain. There is something worth sitting with here. The same culture that produced the angel in the house, the same culture that elevated domesticity and marital fidelity to the level of a civic religion, also produced an insatiable appetite for the spectacle of their violation, not despite the ideology, but because of it. The drama of the divorce court was dramatic precisely because the stakes of domestic virtue were so high. The fall was only interesting in proportion to the height from which it occurred. And the newspapers made choices in how they covered these cases that were not simply journalistic, they were moral positioning. A woman in a divorce case who was articulate, who dressed well, who presented herself with composure and fought her corner with intelligence, she was covered differently from a woman who wept or who appeared uncertain or who came from a social background that offered less protection. The woman with social presence could sometimes generate a sympathetic press coverage that complicated the simple narrative of fallen woman. The woman without it could not. George Bartolow Campbell, Lady Collins' husband in the case I mentioned earlier, employed a legal team that understood very well how the press worked and that had calculated correctly that certain kinds of coverage would damage his wife's credibility regardless of the actual evidence. The case was tried in the newspapers as much as in the courtroom. And the techniques being deployed, the calculated leak, the managed narrative, the use of press coverage to shape public opinion about a legal proceeding were recognizably modern in a way that everything else about Victorian life tends to obscure. The press was not simply reporting Victorian adultery. It was a participant in the system that produced, managed, and punished it. Now I want to return briefly to the question of class, because everything I have been describing operates very differently as you move through the layers of Victorian society, and I do not want to leave the impression that adultery was primarily a concern of the respectable classes. Among the working poor of Victorian England, the circumstances of intimate life were organized around an entirely different set of constraints. Overcrowding, the physical reality of multiple people sharing a single room, a single bed, in the tenement housing of industrial cities, made the kind of carefully maintained private emotional life that I have been describing essentially impossible. The discretion required for a secret relationship demands physical space, and physical space was precisely what the Victorian poor did not have. But desire did not disappear because the space for its management was absent. It expressed itself instead in patterns of irregular union, couples living together without marriage, common law arrangements, the sequential partnerships of men and women whose circumstances made legal marriage too expensive or too complicated or simply beside the point. The Victorian reformers who surveyed the lives of the working poor and reported with varying degrees of horror on the irregularity of sexual and domestic arrangements among them were observing not moral failure but economic reality. Marriage, as a legal and social institution, was not accessible in the same way to people who could barely afford the fee for the ceremony. And the double standard, while it existed everywhere, took a different form in different classes. Working-class women who fell outside the boundaries of respectability did not lose the visiting lists or the social calls that defined middle-class social life. They lost employment. They lost the already fragile economic security that domestic service or factory work provided. They lost, in some cases, their children to the workhouse. The penalty was economic rather than social, but it was no less real, no less crushing, no less systematically directed at women rather than men. A Victorian England deserves more attention than it usually receives in discussions of Victorian adultery, because it was the medium through which the private lives of some people became public property, and through which the public's appetite for that particular kind of truth was both served and intensified. By the 1860s and 1870s, the popular press had developed what we would recognize, without too much translation, as a modern tabloid sensibility. The technology of cheap printing, combined with rising literacy rates and the distribution networks that the railways made possible, had created a newspaper market that competed fiercely for readers. And what readers wanted, what they had always wanted, in every society with a sufficiently developed communications infrastructure, was other people's private lives. Divorce court reports were the Victorian equivalent of reality television. The cases were covered in detail that the participants would have found excruciating, specific dates, named hotels, quoted correspondence, the testimony of servants about what they had observed through the keyhole or inferred from the evidence of bed linen. Nothing was too particular. Nothing was beneath the interest of a readership that had been trained by decades of domestic ideology to treat the home as sacred, and that found in the disasters of other people's domestic lives a satisfaction that the ideology itself would have been hard-pressed to explain. There is something worth sitting with here. The same culture that produced the angel in the house, the same culture that elevated domesticity and marital fidelity to the level of a civic religion, also produced an insatiable appetite for the spectacle of their violation, not despite the ideology, but because of it. The drama of the divorce court was dramatic precisely because the stakes of domestic virtue were so high. The fall was only interesting in proportion to the height from which it occurred. And the newspapers made choices in how they covered these cases that were not simply journalistic, they were moral positioning. A woman in a divorce case who was articulate, who dressed well, who presented herself with composure and fought her corner with intelligence. She was covered differently from a woman who wept, or who appeared uncertain, or who came from a social background that offered less protection. The woman with social presence could sometimes generate a sympathetic press coverage that complicated the simple narrative of fallen woman. The woman without it could not. George Bartolot Campbell, Lady Collins' husband in the case I mentioned earlier, employed a legal team that understood very well how the press worked, and that had calculated correctly that certain kinds of coverage would damage his wife's credibility regardless of the actual evidence. The case was tried in the newspapers as much as in the courtroom, and the techniques being deployed, the calculated leak, the managed narrative, the use of press coverage to shape public opinion about a legal proceeding were recognizably modern in a way that everything else about Victorian life tends to obscure. The press was not simply reporting Victorian adultery. It was a participant in the system that produced, managed, and punished it. Now I want to return briefly to the question of class, because everything I have been describing operates very differently as you move through the layers of Victorian society, and I do not want to leave the impression that adultery was primarily a concern of the respectable classes. Among the working poor of Victorian England, the circumstances of intimate life were organized around an entirely different set of constraints: overcrowding, The physical reality of multiple people sharing a single room, a single bed in the tenement housing of industrial cities made the kind of carefully maintained private emotional life that I have been describing essentially impossible. The discretion required for a secret relationship demands physical space, and physical space was precisely what the Victorian poor did not have. But desire did not disappear because the space for its management was absent. It expressed itself instead in patterns of irregular union, couples living together without marriage, common law arrangements, the sequential partnerships of men and women whose circumstances made legal marriage too expensive or too complicated, or simply beside the point. The Victorian reformers who surveyed the lives of the working poor and reported, with varying degrees of horror, on the irregularity of sexual and domestic arrangements among them, were observing not moral failure but economic reality. Marriage, as a legal and social institution, was not accessible in the same way to people who could barely afford the fee for the ceremony. And the double standard, while it existed everywhere, took a different form in different classes. Working class women who fell outside the boundaries of respectability did not lose the visiting lists or the social calls that defined middle class social life. They lost employment. They lost the already fragile economic security that domestic service or factory work provided. They lost, in some cases, their children to the workhouse. The penalty was economic rather than social, but it was no less real, no less crushing, no less systematically directed at women rather than men. He emerged from prison 2 years later, broken in health and in spirit, exiled from England, dead within 3 years of his release. He was 46 years old. His partner, Lord Alfred Douglas, lived until 1945. He spent the decades after Wilde's death constructing and reconstructing his version of events, occupying and vacating various moral positions, publishing memoirs, fighting lawsuits, writing poetry of variable quality. He outlived Wilde by almost half a century and died having never quite settled on how to feel about what had happened. There is a particular kind of courage that history is not very good at recognizing, not the courage of the battlefield, which is visible and documented and rewarded with monuments, not the courage of public protest or political leadership, which leaves a record precisely because it intended to, but the quiet, private, largely unwitnessed courage of a person who decides, inside an impossible structure, to insist on her own reality anyway. Tonight I want to spend some time with that courage, not to romanticize it. The women who made these choices paid for them, often enormously, and the paying should not be softened or aestheticized into something more comfortable than it was. But I want to sit with the fact of the choosing, because it matters. Let me begin with someone whose name you may know in one context, but perhaps not in this one. George Eliot, the pen name of Marianne Evans, the woman who wrote Middlemarch and The Mill on the Floss and several other novels that are still considered among the finest produced in the English language, lived for almost a quarter of a century in a domestic partnership with a man named George Henry Lewis. She was not married to him because he could not marry her. He was married to someone else. Legally, his wife Agnes had had several children by another man, but under the laws of the day, Lewis could not divorce her because he had previously registered those children as his own, which was interpreted as condoning the adultery that produced them. The law, in one of its characteristic moments of elaborate self-defeating logic, had made it impossible for him to dissolve a marriage that had already effectively dissolved itself. And so Marianne Evans and George Lewes chose each other anyway. They lived together publicly, introducing each other as husband and wife, occupying a social position that was, by Victorian standards, scandalous in the extreme. She lost the friendship of her brother, with whom she had been close her entire life. He refused to speak to her for over 20 years after she entered the arrangement with Lewes. She was no longer received in many of the homes that had welcomed her before. The respectable world drew its skirts aside. She continued, during this period, to write the work that made her one of the most celebrated writers in English literature. What strikes me about Marianne Evans, about George Eliot, is not simply the courage of the choice, though that was real. It is the quality of the thinking behind it. She was one of the most intellectually serious people of her era. She had read philosophy, theology, the emerging science of her time. She understood precisely what she was doing and what it would cost her. She was not swept away. She was not irrational. She looked at the rules and decided they were wrong, and she bore the consequences of that decision with a consistency and a dignity that required, over many years, enormous internal reserves. Her relationship with Lewes appears to have been genuinely what she said it was, a partnership of equals, a working life shared between two people who respected each other's minds and sustained each other's work, and managed, within the cramped and hostile space that Victorian society offered them, to build something that functioned like a genuine home. She outlived him by 2 years. At the age of 60, she did something that surprised almost everyone who knew her. She married John Walter Cross, 20 years her junior, who had been a close friend. It was a legal marriage this time. Lewes was dead and she was free, and whether this marriage was a response to loneliness, a desire for the legal protection she had never had, a late flowering of something else entirely, she died within a year of it and left no definitive answer. What she left instead was the work. Dorothea Brooke in Middlemarch, reaching for something she cannot quite name but cannot stop reaching for. Maggie Tulliver in The Mill on the Floss, caught between the demands of her world and the demands of her own nature, and unable to satisfy both. Her characters, particularly her female characters, move through exactly the emotional territory she knew from the inside, the gap between what a woman was permitted to be and what she actually was, the cost of closing that gap, the cost of not closing it. The novels are the private life made legible. They are what happened when the hidden world of feeling found a form in which it could speak. Now, alongside this famous and relatively well-documented story, I want to place something smaller and less celebrated, but in some ways more vivid in its particularity. In the Bodleian Library at Oxford, there is a collection of letters written over approximately 7 years in the 1870s and 1880s between a woman I will call H and a man whose identity has been partially obscured by the family that eventually donated the collection. What we know from the letters themselves is that H was married unhappily to a man considerably older than herself, that she had 2 children, and that the man to whom she wrote was a friend of her husband's who had at some point become something much more than that. The letters are extraordinary not for their content. They are careful letters, full of the plausible deniability of Victorian coded correspondence, but for the quality of consciousness they reveal. H was clearly intelligent. She was clearly reading everything she could lay hands on. She references Middlemarch in one letter as though it contained something she needed to be careful not to say directly. She writes about a painting she has seen at an exhibition in terms that make it entirely clear she is writing about something else, about the quality of light in a certain afternoon, about what it feels like to stand beside someone and feel, for a moment, the particular warmth of being genuinely seen. She writes, in a letter from 1879, about what she calls the life behind the life. I have discovered, she says, that I live in two registers simultaneously, and that the one which is visible, the one which appears in the photographs and the household accounts and the Sunday service, contains so much less of me than the other that I have begun to wonder if the visible one is real at all. That phrase has stayed with me because I think it is the most precise description I have found of what Victorian adultery actually felt like from the inside, not as transgression, not as scandal, but as the discovery of a part of oneself that the official life had no room for. H's correspondence ends abruptly in 1883. We do not know why. There is no scandal in the public record that attaches to her name. There is nothing. She simply stops writing, or the letters stop surviving, and whatever happened next, reconciliation, discovery, the quiet death of the feeling, the quiet death of the person, is not recorded. She disappears into the silence that closed over so many of the women who navigated this territory without either the talent to make the experience into art or the infamy to make it into news. But she was real. That private interior was real. And the letters that survived her, 7 years of careful coded truth, are as complete an account of a human interior as I have encountered anywhere in the Victorian archive. And I want to spend a moment with something that these women's stories, George Eliot's and H's and the hundreds of others behind them, all share, which I think is the most important thing this entire long night is moving toward. There were women in Victorian England who found a way to hold both things at once, the hidden life and the public one, without the fracture that the system was designed to make inevitable. Not many. The conditions were too hostile, the surveillance too thorough, the consequences of discovery too devastating for this kind of balance to be anything other than exceptional. But they existed, and they did it not through luck or through social privilege alone, but through a quality that the Victorian moral framework was particularly ill-equipped to recognize in women, intelligence deployed strategically in the service of survival. The hostess, the woman at the center of a major Victorian social network, the organizer of the great dinner parties, the manager of the country house weekend, the person through whose drawing room the intellectual and political life of the era flowed, occupied a position of remarkable informal power. And some of these women used that power with a sophistication that went well beyond the management of seating arrangements. Frances Anne Vane Tempest, the Marchioness of Londonderry, was one of the most socially powerful women of the early Victorian era, a conservative political hostess whose salon at Londonderry House was, during the 1830s and 1840s, essentially a seat of political influence. Her relationship with the statesman Prince Metternich, conducted during his visits to London and through an extensive correspondence that continued for years afterward, was an open secret in the diplomatic circles of the time. She managed the relationship with such careful social architecture, conducting it always within the framework of politically useful friendship, never allowing it to become the kind of obvious transgression that invited official response, that it never destroyed what she had built. She continued to receive, to influence, to manage the political world through the drawing room. She was fortunate in ways that most women were not. Her social position was so elevated that the ordinary mechanisms of social punishment barely reached her. She had the resources of rank that provided a kind of insulation against consequences that would have destroyed someone 3 rungs down the social ladder. And she understood, with a political intelligence that her male contemporaries respected even when they declined to acknowledge it, that the management of appearances was itself a form of power. But she is not the only example, and the dynamic she represents, women using social intelligence and positioning to maintain a degree of private freedom within a public framework of impeccable respectability, appears in smaller and less documented ways throughout the Victorian record. The woman who managed her social calendar so that the days when a particular visitor came were also the days when her husband was reliably elsewhere. The woman whose charitable work, the genuine Victorian industry of voluntary service, visiting the poor, organizing benefit concerts, managing subscription lists, provided both cover for her movements and a sphere of activity that was genuinely hers, in which she was competent and valued and seen for something other than her domestic role. The woman whose friendship with another woman served as both a genuine emotional resource and, occasionally, as the cover within which a third relationship was maintained. Victorian women were not passive in the face of the system that constrained them. They were, many of them, extraordinarily creative in navigating it, and the forms that creativity took, the social intelligence, the careful management of appearances, the use of permitted activities as cover for forbidden ones, are a kind of testimony to the extraordinary adaptability of the human desire for freedom within constraint. There is one more figure I want to bring in here before we reach our final resting place. Not a famous name, not a literary figure, not a woman whose story was preserved because someone of influence cared to preserve it, a woman who exists in the historical record only in a single letter, a letter written to a friend, clearly in response to some development in her situation that the letter itself does not specify, but that its words make it possible to partially reconstruct. The letter is dated 1891 and is held in a small regional archive. The writer, whose name I will simply give as E, writes to her friend about what she calls having made a decision. She does not specify the decision directly. She writes instead about walking in the garden that morning and noticing the frost on the grass and deciding, as she stood there, that she had spent enough of her life being cold, that whatever warmth she had found she intended to keep, that she was not, she says, prepared to choose the correct thing over the real thing. Not anymore. She does not tell us what the correct thing or the real thing was in her specific situation. She does not need to. The grammar of the distinction, correct versus real, surface versus felt, what the world required versus what actually sustained her, is the grammar that runs through the whole of this long night's story. The same grammar that runs through Catherine Dickens's gift of the letters to the archive, through H's account of the life behind the life, through George Eliot's choice of Lewis and the 20 years of consequence that followed. The correct thing or the real thing? It is not, in the end, a Victorian question. It is a human one, and the particular intensity with which Victorian England forced its people to confront it by building a world of such demanding correctness that realness had almost nowhere to go, gave that question a sharpness, a desperation, a specificity of texture that the history of that era carries still. I want to return to something that I mentioned earlier and have been circling around for much of this long night, the question of what it actually felt like day to day to sustain a double life in Victorian England, not in the dramatic moments of discovery or decision, but in the ordinary texture of the living. Because the hidden life was not always passionate. It was not always the heightened experience of secret meetings and coded letters and the particular electricity of forbidden proximity. Most of the time, it was simply there, a presence in the background of the ordinary day. Something carried the way you carry a private thought through a public space. The woman who sat at the breakfast table across from her husband and thought about something she could not say. The man who attended the Sunday service and experienced, underneath the familiar words of the liturgy, a layer of consciousness entirely his own. The ordinary evening at home, managing the children and the household and the conversation, with that whole other register of existence running parallel and silent and absolutely present. There is a particular quality to this kind of sustained double consciousness, and it is not glamorous. It is exhausting. It requires a constant division of attention, one layer of self managing the surface, the other maintaining the interior. It requires the continuous performance of a self that is not entirely oneself, for an audience that cannot be allowed to see through the performance. And it requires this not in dramatic moments of crisis, but in the mundane, repetitive, ordinary texture of every single day. Victorian writers who had experience of this, and there were many, sometimes captured it in their fiction in ways that are recognizable precisely because they are not dramatic. The small moment of recognition between two people in a room full of other people. The sentence begun and then redirected into something else. The look that lasts a half second too long before composing itself back into social acceptability. These small moments are the actual texture of the hidden life, not the grand passion, but the management of the grand passion inside the conditions of ordinary existence. And what that management cost over time, the specific kind of internal wear that comes from sustained performance, from the continuous labor of maintaining surfaces, is something the historical record rarely captures directly, but that the letters and diaries and fictional accounts suggest, in their accumulated weight, was considerable. The loneliness of carrying a secret life is not the same as the loneliness of having no life at all. In some ways, it is more specifically painful because it involves the continuous presence of something real, something felt, something that is yours, while requiring that it be entirely invisible to the people who constitute your social existence. You are seen by everyone and known by no one. You are never alone because you are always in company. And you are always alone because the company cannot see you. George Eliot wrote about this, obliquely, in almost everything she produced. Her characters are always navigating the gap between their inner reality and the social role they are required to perform, always discovering that the people around them are seeing a version of them that is real in all its external features and utterly wrong in everything that matters. Her work is in part an extended meditation on the specific loneliness of being seen and not known. And that loneliness, not the absence of connection, but the presence of connection that cannot reach the part of you that most needs to be reached, is perhaps the most precise description available of what it felt like to live a hidden life in Victorian England, not the romance of the secret, the specific human cost of the concealment. All of them were doing something that the Victorian moral framework insisted was wrong, morally wrong, socially destructive, a betrayal of the sacred obligations they had undertaken And yet in each of their accounts, in the diaries, the letters, the fiction, the fragments that survive, what comes through is not the sensation of transgression. What comes through is the sensation of realness. The real afternoon. The consciousness of being in the hidden space, more fully oneself than anywhere else. This tells us something important about the Victorian moral framework itself. It tells us that its definitions of virtue and vice were not mapped neatly onto human experience, that the thing it called immoral was often in the lived experience of the people involved the most genuine thing in their lives. And the thing it called virtuous, the performed composure, the managed surface, the angel in the house, was often what felt least real, least human, least true. The system was not wrong that intimate loyalty matters. It was wrong about where the fault lines of loyalty actually run in a human life. It was wrong about what it is exactly that constitutes a betrayal of a spouse, of a society, of oneself. And we are about to move into the final chapter of this long night, which is about exactly that question, about what Victorian England's great hidden life left behind. What it changed, what it produced, what it seeded in the soil of the century that followed. Because desire, however carefully suppressed, however thoroughly managed, however firmly locked behind the surface of respectability, does not simply disappear. It finds form, it finds expression. It reshapes the world in its own image, in ways that the world often does not immediately recognize. Victorian England's hidden life was not simply a collection of secrets. It was, in the end, a kind of argument, an argument conducted in flowers and letters and court records and novels and preserved diaries and carefully arranged meetings in the less frequented paths of public parks. An argument about what human beings actually are and what they actually need and what any social structure that claims to serve them must, finally, be willing to accommodate. That argument did not end in 1901 when Victoria died. It simply moved into a new era, and its traces are everywhere around us still. And it is there, in that long aftermath, in the slow transformation of the world the Victorians built, that I want to take us for the final part of this night. We are near the end of our long night's journey now. Let the room settle a little. Let your breathing slow. We have traveled a long way through Victorian England tonight, through its drawing rooms and its divorce courts, its coded letters and its hidden meetings, its famous scandals and its forgotten women. We have looked at the surface of one of history's most elaborately maintained moral performances, and at what was moving persistently and irresistibly beneath it. And now I want to think about what all of that hidden life ultimately produced. What happens to a civilization's suppressed desire? Where does it go? What shape does it take when it can no longer be contained? The answer in the case of Victorian England is plural and strange and beautiful in ways the era would not entirely have recognized or approved of. It went, first of all, into the literature. The Victorian novel is one of the great forms of human art, in part because it was the primary space in which Victorian emotional life could speak honestly. The drawing room enforced silence. The novel did not. George Eliot, as I said earlier, made the hidden interior of her life into fiction, but so did Hardy, whose Tess of the d'Urbervilles and Jude the Obscure laid out the sexual and emotional damage of Victorian moral systems with a directness that scandalized the reviewing establishment and got him effectively run out of novel writing. So did Henry James, whose convoluted plots are almost always, at their core, about the management and mismanagement of desire in systems of social surveillance. So did the sensation novelists, Wilkie Collins, Mary Elizabeth Braddon, whose enormously popular fictions of bigamy and secret marriages and hidden identities were read voraciously by the very middle-class women whose lives those systems most constrained. There is something wonderful about this. The most forbidden emotional content of Victorian life became, in fictional form, the most popular reading matter of the era. People who could not speak certain things aloud read them in 3-volume novels borrowed from lending libraries. They recognized themselves in the characters. They felt the specific texture of their own experience reflected back at them in a form that the social world refused to provide. The hidden life found its legitimacy in art. It went also into the reform movements that began to reshape Victorian society from its middle decades onward. The women who wrote pamphlets and organized petitions and eventually forced legislative change on the Married Women's Property Acts. They were not, most of them, writing from abstract principle alone. They were writing from the lived experience of a system that they or someone they loved had discovered. From the inside was built to destroy them. The law that let a husband take his wife's earnings. The law that let him keep her children regardless of what he had done to her. The law that required her to prove aggravated adultery while he needed only to prove one instance. These were not abstract injustices. They were the specific conditions under which real women's real lives had been dismantled. And the anger that drove the reform, the energy behind the Married Women's Property Acts of 1870 and 1882, the Matrimonial Causes Act of 1878, which allowed women to obtain a separation order against a violent husband, the Infant Custody Act of 1886, which finally gave mothers a meaningful legal claim on their children. That anger was accumulated over decades in the private experience of women who had discovered what the system was actually made of. The hidden life made the visible one change. And then there was something more diffuse and harder to trace, but in some ways the most lasting. Victorian England's sustained confrontation with the gap between its official morality and its actual emotional life seated in the culture and in the individual people who lived through it, a question that the 20th century would eventually force to the surface. The question of whether the rules made sense. Not whether any rules should exist. Not whether intimate loyalty matters, or whether the well-being of children matters, or whether the emotional lives of the people inside a marriage matter. All of those things matter, and the Victorian era's chaos of hidden lives produced more than its share of damage to wives, to husbands, to children, to the people caught in the invisible middle of all that carefully managed duplicity. But the specific rules, the specific architecture of a system that let a man keep a mistress and keep his reputation while destroying a woman's entire life for the same act, the specific logic of a moral framework that required women to erase their selfhood as the price of respectability. The specific cruelty of a divorce law designed not to adjudicate fairly between human beings in conflict, but to protect a social structure at the expense of the individuals within it. Those rules were not natural law. They were not eternal truths. They were human constructions built by specific people at a specific historical moment in service of specific interests. And the accumulated evidence of Victorian private life, the letters and the court records and the diaries and the coded flower arrangements and the endless, intricate, desperate negotiations of hidden desire constituted, across decades, an argument against them. An argument that eventually won. Not cleanly, not all at once, not without cost, and not without producing its own new injustices as older ones receded. But the England that emerged from the Victorian era was one in which the gap between official morality and lived reality had become finally too visible to simply plaster over, and the process of reckoning with that gap, the slow, painful, contested process of bringing the law and the social structure closer to what human beings actually are, is one of the defining projects of the 20th century. Victorian adultery, seen in this light, is not just a collection of private dramas. It is a chapter in the long, unfinished history of what it means to try to organize a society around human beings as they actually are, rather than human beings as ideology requires them to be. And there is something in that, some long, slow movement of truth working its way through layers of suppression toward the surface, that I find genuinely moving, not romantic, not a story with easy heroes or clean resolutions, but moving in the way that all genuinely human stories are moving, complicated, costly, full of specific people making specific choices under conditions they did not design, and leaving in those choices some trace of what it was like to be alive in that particular moment of time. The woman who kept the letters because she wanted the world to know he had loved her. The woman who wrote in a private letter no one was supposed to read about the life behind the life. The woman who fought in a courtroom when she was supposed to accept her fate in silence. The woman who chose, with full knowledge of the cost, to insist on the reality of what she felt. They are all part of this story. And they were all in their different ways telling the same truth, that human desire does not observe the boundaries that authority draws around it, that intimacy cannot be fully legislated, that the inner life insists, regardless of what the outer world demands, on its own existence. And that insistence, quiet, private, mostly unrecorded, conducted in the language of flowers and ambiguous letters and carefully arranged afternoon meetings in the less frequented paths of Victorian parks, was, in the end, one of the most consequential forces in the making of the modern world. There is one more thing I want to say before we let this night settle completely, about the archive. About the question of what survives and what is lost, and what that tells us about the people who made those decisions. The Victorians were, in many ways, extraordinary preservers. They kept letters, diaries, household accounts, court records, newspaper files. They built archives and libraries and collections. The material record of Victorian life is, by the standards of most historical periods, remarkably rich. And yet the most intimate documentary record, the letters between people conducting hidden relationships, the diaries of people recording the life they could not show, was very often destroyed by the people who wrote it, in moments of fear or prudence. Destroyed by their families after their deaths, in the service of reputations. destroyed by the recipients who understood that preservation was itself a risk. What survives, therefore, is a selection, not a random sample of Victorian private life, but a curated one, shaped by decisions about what was safe to keep and what was dangerous to preserve. The letters that exist do so because someone judged that the risk of keeping them was worth the value of what they contained. The diaries that survive were hidden well enough or judged by the people who found them to be worth the complication of preservation. This means that what we know about Victorian hidden desire is almost certainly a small and somewhat skewed fraction of what existed. The richest emotional material, the most honest, the most explicit, the most fully human, is disproportionately among the things that were destroyed. What we have is the careful edge of something much larger and more complex. And so when we think about the Victorian hidden life, when we try to imagine the full scope of it, the millions of private emotional realities running parallel to the official record, we have to hold in mind the space between what survives and what was lost. That space is enormous, and it was filled with human experience as vivid, as complicated, as fully alive as anything that was preserved. The destroyed letters, the burned diaries, the arrangements that left no trace because everyone involved understood that traces were dangerous. These are the ghost archive of Victorian private life, enormous, irretrievable, present in the negative space of everything that does survive. And perhaps the most honest thing I can say about the subject of this long night is this: we have only seen the edges, the parts that were kept, the cases that were tried, the novels that were published, the letters that were preserved by accident or sentiment or family oversight, or the particular courage of someone who decided that truth mattered more than reputation. Behind all of that, in the great silence where the destroyed things would have been, there are people living their hidden lives, writing their coded letters and arranging their secret afternoons, and carrying in the ordinary texture of their ordinary days something that the world could not see. We cannot reach them now. We can only know that they were there. We came tonight to look at Victorian England's hidden life, at its desire and its duplicity, its damage and its dignity, and what we found there, beneath all the composure, behind all the performance, inside all the carefully locked rooms, was simply this: people wanting what people have always wanted: to be known, to be real, to feel, even inside impossible conditions, that the life they were living was, somewhere in its hidden interior, genuinely theirs. That wanting was not the worst thing about the Victorian era. It was in many ways the most human thing about it. And on that thought, on the long, slow, very human truth of it, I want to let this night rest. Thank you for spending these hours here with me in the quiet. If these long journeys through the quieter corners of history are what you come to for your evenings, I hope you will find your way back to dreamy ages. And if you haven't subscribed yet, this is a gentle invitation to do that too. Sleep well.